Is the GOP poised for a major comeback? That is the question on many people's minds as the 2024 presidential election kicks up into high gear. Today, I'm joined by Patrick Ruffini. He has a book out, Party of the People, Inside the Multiracial Populist Coalition Remaking the GOP, and he takes a look at Trump and the fascinating things surrounding former President Donald Trump, who is the presumptive Republican nominee for president. And Trump brought together what Ruffini says is a fascinating coalition of people. We're going to get into all of that today, the most surprising pieces of the political puzzle, what we can expect, and so much more. With no further ado, here is Patrick Ruffini. Let's start with the Republican Party right now and some of the big misconceptions. We're going to get into your book, which I'm excited to chat about. But when you look at some of the claims, the things that are said about the Republican Party today, what do you think are some of those maybe big misconceptions?
I mean, I think if you look at, let's just take a look at the, let's say, party's prospects over the long haul. You have a lot of dialogue about the Republican Party is the party of basically old rich white people, and I think that has become a little bit of a dated criticism. A lot of it remains with the concern that Republicans are losing a younger generation of voters. But when you actually look at it, that is as much a function of changing racial demographics. And really, my point is that Republicans have kind of figured out a way to make up ground and have done so in the most unexpected way possible with populism. Basically, in the last two elections, they've done much better with Latino voters. They've done much better with white working class voters. But let's zoom in on non-white voters for a second. We go back to the 2012 election. We had that famous Republican autopsy that said the Republican Party is doomed unless we do something like comprehensive immigration reform. Donald Trump takes that and does the exact opposite in 2016 and wins. And he wins with a coalition that is much more rooted in the working class, much more rooted in the Rust Belt. And this turns out to be this hack because those voters are in states that are pretty close on the presidential level, but Republicans never before were able to win a state like Pennsylvania. And then flash forward to 2020, Trump loses. But the fact that he does well, continues to do well with white working class voters and adds voters, adds Latino voters, adds African American voters, adds even a lot of Asian American voters to his tally, makes it really close. And makes it so that he can run again, essentially, in 2024. All right. The fact that election was close, contested, he says it was stolen, right? And a lot of people believe him. And as a result of that, just the mechanics of that, he is still in the game.
Yeah, no, it's interesting too, because 2020, and you would know better than I would, you look at this, for a living, but, when you look at the numbers and you look at the events that were happening, you had COVID, which was a very strange event, obviously once in multiple generation event. You had so many different factors that made it much more, and then Trump himself being sort of an outlier, that make it so hard to compare it to almost any other election. Yeah, it's interesting. And the indictments and all the other things that are going on, they don't seem to be doing it. If anything, it's having an inverse effect. I mean, it seems to be actually helping him, or at least not hurting him at this point, which is really interesting to see. I don't know if you want to react to that at all, but just looking at those numbers, it's almost shocking.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really disagree with that at all.
It's wild, but well, let me pivot a little bit here, because I want to get into education, which I know is something you talk about in the book, and I want to get into your motivation for writing the book. But one of the other issues that I found very interesting, some of these social issues that it seemed like maybe the Republicans were going to lose on, and obviously abortion's complicated, but education itself, the parents showing up at board meetings, seeing people so frustrated, it seems like Republicans could actually win on some of these social issues, that there's actually some power there that maybe 2 years ago people would have thought wouldn't have existed. What's your take on that?
I think You go back to 2015, 2016, and there's so much triumphalism on the left. They think it's the end of history. You had the Obergefell decision. You had just a number of things happening in the culture at the time where the cultural left in particular um, was very triumphant. And now I think we're seeing kind of the overreach on some of those items where I think the politics of a lot of those issues, back in, even going back a decade, but go back to the old kind of moral majority debates and in the 80s and 90s. The politics on a lot of those issues didn't always favor conservatives. But now, the left feels like they've become so dominant within these institutions, feels like, their view has prevailed on a lot of these cultural issues. And what that's created is a backlash, right? It's created, the fact that now we no longer have exclusion of folks on the basis of race, gender, all the ways that the left, was, actively against for decades. You have exclusion of folks and discrimination of folks for their political opinions, for voicing any kind of dissent against this prevailing cultural tide. And so a lot of that is saying people just pumping the brakes and saying, we don't like this overreach, particularly when it relates to our schools,
Hmm.
which should be a completely neutral space free of any kind of agenda. Um, that is, I think, what you saw in Virginia very clearly in 2021. And that's not just an issue that riled up the base, as the left likes to say, right? It's an issue that united moderates, independents, parents, and conservatives behind Glenn Youngkin. And, he was able to win in a state that Biden had won by 10 points on the power of that issue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I live in New York, and I can tell you the conversations anecdotally that are going on here among very progressive people are conversations that would, I think, shock some of these leaders in the Democratic Party. People are not comfortable with some of this, and they're not really loving, especially the shutdown of free speech, right? I think that's a
Yeah.
big piece of this puzzle that is making people on all sides uncomfortable. But let's pivot to the book, Party of the People. This is obviously hitting a year out from, and we always say this, but it probably is going to be the most contentious election ever. And you're looking at the Republican Party here, and you talked a little bit about this before, but what was your motivation? Why did you want to get this book out there now?
So partly it's a personal journey. I was one of those Republican establishment consultants that didn't like Donald Trump in 2016, campaigned against him, and thought he would lose, and thought this would be a complete disaster for the party. And lo and behold, he wins. And I reassessed, right? Now, I didn't necessarily I didn't turn myself into a Trump sycophant. I didn't turn myself into a Trump fan. As a result, that's not what I'm saying. But the political power of what he created. And I think even if you're on the left, even if you're not a Trump supporter, you have to recognize that what he was able to do was really tap into the large majority of the electorate who never graduated college. And that's where he gained all of his votes from when you look at 2016, both 2016 and 2020. He was able to run a campaign uniquely optimized for those folks in a way that Mitt Romney is a very decent person. John McCain is a very decent person. George W. Bush, who I worked for, again, very decent person, but we're not able to unify, that specific voting coalition in the same way. As a result, Trump is able to compete in states maybe that Republicans did not in the past, right? Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Now there are downsides, Georgia and Arizona, right? Trump lost in 2020. Previous Republicans might not have lost those states. But on balance, my argument is that this has been positive. So even though I personally come from this very different background, a very different political outlook within the Republican Party than Donald Trump, I can really appreciate what he did to bring working class people in to the party. Now that said, do I personally think he is the answer moving forward in 2024? No, not really. And I do think that you have, we talked about Glenn Youngkin, not that he's a candidate, not going to be a candidate. Let's put that to rest. But he was able to recreate much of the Trump coalition in Virginia. And Ron DeSantis, right, we'll see what he does in these next few contests. But he was also able to recreate Trump's coalition and then add a whole bunch of new people to it. So this seems pretty potent and durable. And it seems potent because this is a long-term trend. I mean, I think Trump was the catalyst for a lot of these shifts in 2016, but this had been going on really for decades in terms of this realignment of working class voters into the GOP and, let's say, wealthier white college educated voters moving or sticking with the Democrats or moving towards the Democrats.
Yeah.
And I think that will happen. It will continue to happen regardless of whether Trump is on the ballot or not.
I mean, that creates a real conundrum for the Democrats too, because if you're walking around saying we're the party of the people, we represent all of these people, and you no longer have the coalition that you had, or it's no longer maybe
Right.
based on the economics and the money that you have coming in, it's more based on education levels, which one thing, and I'd love for you to unpack this or correct it, if I say anything you don't agree with here, but it is interesting because you look at America, and it's a country where most people, the majority, don't go out and get a college education. But a lot of people in certain pockets, like here in New York, they'll talk about it as though everybody has a college education. This is where everybody is. That's not, there are lots of other ways to learn, and that's a whole other conversation. But your argument, if I'm not mistaken here, is that education is sort of coming in as a replacement to helping sort of maybe predict where people are going to fall when it comes to these election cycles. Speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have these elite bubbles, especially along the coast, especially, you're in New York, I'm in Washington, D.C. I am the stereotypical member of the elite bubble. Even though we don't like to acknowledge it, right? I mean,
Right.
but I think we pretty much everyone who discusses politics online in any real way, which I think is, really maybe a lot of our listeners, but
Yes. Yeah.
probably has a college degree. Who you don't see represented are people without college degrees, and especially, not to sound like the diversity police here, but especially non-white people without college degrees. Now, a lot of those folks still vote Democratic. I don't want to say otherwise, but they're shifting. So all the new vote, I am mostly concerned as a data nerd, as a political data person. I'm mostly concerned about shifts from election cycle to election. What new votes can I get? Because so much of our partisanship is baked in. But if I can move people off that baseline, that's positive, right? So all I see in those communities in the last few election cycles, and even heading into 2024, is all positive for Republicans and all negative for Democrats, all negative for Biden in terms of his weakness among those voters. Now, we're talking about that now. But the problem is, when you look at political Twitter/X, you look at the conversation in the media, it's all happening among the voters who don't really matter, right? Who
Mm.
don't decide elections because they don't want to switch their votes from election cycle to election cycle. So we really have to look at the voters that do. Most of those voters are working class. Most of those voters don't have college degrees. They're less likely to be white. And so my argument is, let's focus. Let's actually take a very strong focus on those voters specifically and take their views into account.
All right, so I'm going to ask you a question. Nobody has a crystal ball, but I'm curious what you think looking at the numbers right now. And I know it could change tomorrow, but do you think that there's another term for President Trump in 2024? Do you think he wins?
I think today there's a better than even chance, despite the indictments, and we'll see what happens. A lot of unknowns, a lot of unknown variables. There's also a lot of unknown variables for Biden. I mean, really historically uncharted waters here. But I
Yeah, you're
think
gonna
we
have a
do
busy
have to,
year.
yeah, we do. But I think we do have to take the data at face value, right? Not that it can't change. Um, but Biden faces very serious challenges. And the question about his age, is not just a question in my focus groups, in my surveys, but that's code for something else. It's a question about his vitality, his energy level, and his ability to wage this fight for working class families or whatever group, a voter themselves is part of. That is how they talk about Biden's age issue, right? So it's